Hello? Okay, right. We had the pleasure of having Kathy on our table, so we asked her lots of questions. And the first question we asked her is, what can we ask the council to take into account? And she said whether or not they consider biodiversity to be an infrastructure. So, Kathy, how do you convince local councils that biodiversity should be an infrastructure? That's the first question. We want to know how to build green walls, because apparently they're very effective. And how can we create a biodiversity data bank, because we understand that to be a very important resource for understanding the flow of biodiversity.
Interesting. 3 big questions there. If you can make a note of those, we'll go around the room and get the rest of the questions. Glenn.
Thank you. I guess this is a question to all 3 members of the panel, but we were asking about farming, and that's kind of at 2 angles. One, how the animal life, whether it be domesticated farm animals or wildlife in the area, how do we ensure that the farmers are adapting to biodiversity or accept it? And second, farms take up a lot of space, a lot of land. They own a large portion of land. So kind of from a private property angle, how do we ensure that they comply to any changes or targets that we want to reach?
Magic, thank you very much. Catherine, there you are.
Yes, so we wanted a bit more information on kind of where and how many trees would need to be planted to reduce the flood risk, especially bearing in mind that obviously the source of this is sometimes outside of Oxford. You know, the rivers don't go necessarily within boundaries, and so how much would the council be able to do that? And also the same question, I guess, about planting trees to offset our carbon emissions. What's the kind of scale that would be needed and when? We also wanted to know about what the current situation is in terms of looking at things together rather than isolation. So at the moment, is housing and transport and biodiversity planning happening together, or to what extent is that happening together?
Magic, thank you very much. Andrew?
Thank you. We asked the question of the panel, should we use greenbelt land better to help mitigate climate change and improve health and well-being? And if we're planting trees, what sort of trees should we be planting? But there's a rider to the trees, and that is, a speaker said yesterday that planting trees is not a permanent solution to CO2 because of what happens when they die. So we wondered how you tie those two together. We also wanted to know what makes the greenest green space on the Oxford City Greenness map.
That's going to win the sentence with the word greener in the most this weekend.
So we had a question around whether carbon offsetting is just a smokescreen, and if yes, where should we focus? And then, is there already a plan for flooding alleviation, or some kind of plan to conduct a census that I think was mentioned in one of the presentations?
Is that a deliberate pun, smokescreen, Emma?
Hello, picking up on something that we learned in the transport presentation, is there any way that we can capture the impact of biodiversity so that we can measure it in a way that means that we can understand what the co-benefits are for things like health and transport, and therefore bring in funding from those streams? And very simple question, what can Oxford citizens do as individuals? What existing Oxford projects are there that are contributing to sort of make the city a kind of greener and more diverse place?
Marvellous, thank you very much. Who wants to take that last question first? Feels like an obvious one to start with. Anyone?
Well, I think just what can citizens do? I think everybody can play a part in this, and thinking about, you know, even the way that you manage your own area, your own gardens, your own walls, whatever. I think that is the collective becomes very large when everyone starts thinking about that. But also lobbying. I think it's bringing in right from the, you know, I believe that everybody should have access to green space within, you know, 20 metres of their house. Everybody should be arguing that is something we want. We want all citizens to have the right to that. It's not a case of onto the plan estate. It's not the case of planners can come in and buy their way through this and all of a sudden the green space goes. Everybody should have access to it. And I think that is something we should all be voting for with our feet.
So just answering the question in regard to projects going on in Oxford. Well, you've heard about Oxfordshire Trees for the Future. That covers the entire county and many different aspects. Councils, large landowners, universities, communities, lots of community groups now getting involved. So there is plenty of scope there. Other Oxford projects, well, again, we are seeing, I think, many more community groups popping up now in regard to just getting on with things. It seems to us that where the action is being taken right now is within communities, and don't wait. If you've got a really good idea, we're in a city where there is plenty of expertise across many different areas, and that's something that we should be leveraging a little bit more as well. So our position is don't wait, get on with it, and if you don't really feel that you're comfortable starting your own initiative, have a look around. There's a lot going on and a lot for people to get involved with. So yeah, power to us.
Yeah, no, I'm fine, I'll wait.
Okay. Feel free to answer any of the other questions.
Great question, I think, on the green belt. It's a question that we have raised as well. Should we be planting more trees on the green belt? It's very contentious versus housing developments. The green belt is there to protect from urban sprawl, but it may be that some parts of the green belt are maybe less biologically diverse than other areas. So let's look at those parts of the green belt which may be the most valuable for example tree planting. I think I'd love to see further discussion on that.
There's so many on here.
I mean, I think just picking up about biodiversity as the infrastructure and that first question. One of the issues is biodiversity is always considered as the afterthought. It's the sort of nice to have, but actually biodiversity is a luxury we can no longer afford. And I've had that said to me by a minister, said, it's all well and good use of green people, but we've got to provide these roads, this housing. But I think actually, if you're an oil company or an extractive industry, you first of all go and map where your extractive, the thing you need is, and then you plan your other infrastructure around it. It is part of, and that's the way we need to be thinking about biodiversity. Biodiversity, all of it, but I mean the particular areas are so important for flood risk. It shouldn't be an option to think about, well, we're going to put the road through here, so let's just move that out of the way. We have to think of it much more as a fixture, as infrastructure that's there, and then we plan around that, not putting it into the equation at the last stage.
I think I might have a crack at tackling the farming question. So fundamentally, there needs to be more focus on climate within the realms of farming. So we know that there are stewardship schemes to promote more ecologically sensitive farming, but fundamentally I think we're a little bit stuck in the dark ages when it comes to farming. And we would like to see certainly more leadership from the government in helping farmers to farm in a more ecologically sustainable way. We totally understand that we need to be deriving our food from farming as well, but we can be doing this in much more ecologically sensitive ways. But it shouldn't just be up to farmers to kind of deal with that by themselves. They need help, and so there is a very big role that the government can be playing in that, but also farming organisations such as the National Farmers, NFU, really getting behind it as well to help farmers. that will take us on to a whole other discussion around our diets, meat, plant-based, etc. I'm sure everybody is quite aware of those discussions. So these are some really big questions here, but I think we really do need to take a closer look at how farmland is being used, given that here in the UK it represents such a huge proportion of the land. I think 70% of the UK is arable farmland. That's a hell of a lot. We need to get it right on farmland if we're going to be really tackling the climate crisis here in the UK.
Yeah, I mean, just to be really explicit on that, it basically, I mean, so I'm a farmer. Farmers work on a yield per acre basis or a yield per hectare basis. Essentially, if you want the bulk of farmers, there's no money in farming really. There's money in owning land for subsidy today, but there's no money in farming. So if you want farmers to change the way they work, then you will need to pay them to displace any yield that they lose back the other way.
So one of the things that's going on right now with the Environment Act, which should be announced in the Queen's speech, but we all wonder when that's going to happen. But anyway, is that it's because of the Common Agricultural Policy funding, the subsidy funding that goes to farmers is changing. It will stop, and instead it will be a public payment for public goods approach, where farmers will be paid for the value that's there or the societal benefit that their services on land provides to the public. And this very much ties back in with these ideas of actually where are the trees being planted, trees on that land. We want the farmer or the landowner to manage those trees for now and in the future, and therefore they are paid to do that. So it's instead of, in addition to managing it for food, also managing it for the environment. And I think that's a win-win situation. It maintains the food and food security, but it also enhances our environment. But, and there is a but, I'm going to come back, if you don't mind, linking that back through to the question. Somebody said, how many trees need to be planted to reduce flood risk in Oxford? That is a really interesting question, and one that comes back to also, should we view biodiversity as an infrastructure? Because those of you who live in Oxford know we're going to get a great channel built through the centre of Oxford to take away the flood water. And that channel has been designed, it's going to cost millions, even higher than that. And all the work for that is being done, has been worked on by the Environment Agency. Nobody has considered whether or not there is an ecological solution of planting trees, which would not only then provide us with biodiversity, with some carbon sequestration, with soil erosion protection, but also reduce our flood risk. And it comes back to thinking in silos and not really. So often we always, the knee-jerk reaction is to go for the technological solution. We need to reduce pollution, let's put up pollution drawing out towers, not let's plant some green walls. And it's the same with that. So it comes back to really making sure that all aspects, all different solutions are looked at before we are offered one solution. And I think there's too little. We're often just given one option, which is technological, and often nature has that solution for us as well.
Which is why it's important that we don't trash it. So again, just reiterating that really our position is that we want to be protecting and enhancing nature wherever we can. So what does that ambition look like? What does that look like in regard to new housing developments? I think that the council may have a role in being able to set some of the levels for the ambition here in regard to what nature enhancement looks like in relation to housing developments. That's just one example. There are others.
Yeah, fine. So I'm just going to move on and answer this question about is carbon offsetting a smokescreen, just to move away from the sort of biodiversity theme here. Look, it's not a smokescreen. I think carbon offsetting for individuals is going to have a very minimal effect on climate generally. Our view as an organisation is that what we need to see is an economy-wide mandatory price on carbon that basically pays for the societal cost of carbon, which is to take responsibility for all of the impacts of climate change and the cost of dealing with it from the public sector point of view, but also what we call the cost of abatement, which is the commensurate cost of mitigating or reducing or removing a ton of carbon equivalent to that which you're emitting elsewhere. Now, until that happens, and it is starting to happen, I was speaking to someone there about what has happened in the German government's climate plan, which was released this week and then rapidly adapted because the price on carbon that was put in there was just not high enough, and Angela Merkel lost her lead as a result of that. So, you know, until that happens, then you've got to, everyone has a residual carbon footprint associated with their activities, from heating their home, from driving their car, from, if you flying. The first thing you should be doing is trying to reduce at source. There is no substitute for reducing at source. And so, anyone who tells you that offsetting is a substitute for reducing your direct emissions, that is simply not true. However, you will have a residual footprint that you may want to take, or that you will probably want to take responsibility for. You don't have to pay someone to do that. You can look for opportunities to reduce a commensurate amount of carbon elsewhere yourself, and that can be the most simple way for individuals to do that will be through planting trees or something like that. But the bulk of, is it a smokescreen? No, we all should be taking full responsibility for our residual emissions. We can't say, I'm going to reduce 10% or I'm going to reduce 20% and the rest, then I've done my bit, the rest is fine. We have to get to net zero. You have to start taking responsibility for every single ton of carbon you emit every year and bringing it down. And when we are an economy that is driven, and we are a society that is driven by cost. And when it's hitting your pocket, that is when people take action to reduce more. And that is what the crux of the offsetting element is. But for individuals, it is less than 0.5%, 1% of carbon finance in general. We don't believe it should be left up to the individual to make a decision as to whether they should offset or not. Should you? It is far better to reduce at source. If you are going to take that flight, if you are going to drive that high emitting vehicle, then you should absolutely take responsibility for your residual emissions.
Okay, it's lunchtime. Thank you, panel.